Presiding Officer, although there's been some points of consensus in today's debate, I do find it hard to believe that overall it's anything more than an annual box-ticking exercise for this Scottish Government. I don't doubt the Cabinet Secretary's concern about the twin crises of climate change and biodiversity loss. She's always spoken with passion on this subject, and today's motion rightly calls out the unilateral reversal of net zero policies set out by the UK Government. But where is the acknowledgement of this Government's mistakes, the missed targets, the underspends, and the reckless pursuit of private finance initiatives? And that really is the crux of the problem with this Government. Not its targets, but its submission to vested interests. Because what crises of the scale we are facing require is government-backed, industrial-scale change of the kind that this Government has repeatedly cowered away from. Take the Scottish Government's approach to funding nature restoration. Last week, Parliament heard how the Scottish Government has consistently promoted the use of private finance initiatives based on an uncritical acceptance of the so-called funding gap identified by the banker-led Green Finance Institute, an organisation whose credibility is now under significant doubt. But rather than hearing an acknowledgement from the Scottish Government that the way in which it accepted these now discredited figures was irresponsible, Parliament instead heard this Government deny, deflect and double down. So it's clear that this is not a Government serious about protecting our nature for generations to come. Rather, this Government's priority is to outsource responsibility to meet our rightly ambitious net zero targets. And nowhere is this clearer than in this Government's response to our energy transition. Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government regularly pleads powerlessness. But when it comes to areas it could be doing more, it readily shirks its responsibility. Take the offshore training passport as just one example. The passport would provide a route to alignment and recognition of training standards across energy industries to make it easier for workers to do what governments repeatedly tell them to do, to transition away from oil and gas into renewables. The offshore training passport has the support of workers, their trade unions, the industry, the Offshore Petroleum Industry Training Organisation, APITO, and supposedly this Government. And the Scottish Government is quick to claim credit for the passport with frequent references to the funding it has provided. But when I asked the Minister in 2022 to provide regular updates in Parliament on the progress of this publicly funded work, I was told she did not consider it appropriate or necessary, given this is an industry-led process. Now, we're 4 days away from the promised launch of the already 6-month delayed passport. And what news? The Global Wind Organisation, GWO, is reportedly still creating barriers to the passport, with offshore trade unions urging this Government to intervene. Our energy transition is too important and the need for cooperation too great to allow barriers to transition to go unchecked. So the Scottish Government cannot be content to be silent partners in our transition. Ministers must find their voice and bring all parties back round the table for the sake of offshore workers, for the sake of the economy of the North East, and for the sake of our planet. Presiding Officer, for too long, we've allowed our precious environment to be degraded for short-term private profit. This is acutely apparent in the way successive governments have allowed our land to be amassed in ever greater concentration in the hands of so few. Take Trump International Golf Links in Aberdeenshire. This is a site which has long faced opposition from local residents concerned about the environmental impact of the development. Yet the Scottish Government's proposals for land reform would do little to address this. My own proposal for land justice would empower people to challenge existing holdings that aren't working for our communities, and it would make sites like Trump International, which are over 500 hectares, subject to a public interest test. In contrast, the Scottish Government's proposals for land reform are far too timid. They'll only apply to land over 3,000 hectares. That's almost 6 times the size of Trump International, and they won't apply to existing holdings like his. The consultation on my proposal closes at midnight tonight, and I would urge all members to highlight it to their constituents, whatever their views. Presiding Officer, tackling the twin crises of climate change and biodiversity loss can only be done through a recognition of the failings of the capitalist economic system that brought us here. The short-sighted pursuit of limitless profit has led to carbon-intensive practices, the proliferation of single-use plastics, the destruction of biodiverse rich habitats, and the pollution of our environment. So if our transition is truly to be just, we must now see a shift in ideology from this government, away from the pursuit of private finance initiatives and towards community wealth building, so that as we restore nature, as we meet our climate targets, it's the people of Scotland, not multinational corporations, who see the benefits.